Hey, my name is Andrew Kapland, and you're in the middle of listening to a 7-part mini-series going behind the scenes with the Navattic growth team. We explored all kinds of things that typically don't get shared publicly in the growth community. We talked about how they think about growth, how they set their strategy, their operating system, what they track, what they don't track, how often they share internally to drive alignment, and we talked about some of their biggest challenges, their fears, and their speed bumps along the way. Let's jump back in where we left off. So we've talked about what Navattic is. We've talked about what growth means at Navattic, and we talked a little bit about what you're focused on right now and why, and some of the components around your strategy. I'm curious to talk a little bit about challenges and concerns, right? A huge part of working in growth is solving challenges, but probably there's some other challenges around working in growth at Navattic as well. I'd love to explore both of those. So one, what is the biggest challenge that the two of you face just working in growth at Navattic right now?
I think the biggest thing is just, we talked a little bit before about like where to prioritize. And also like, because we're a team of two, limited resources, constantly think about how can we do something in the smallest way to prove that we should work on it more and sort of figure out like what is worth even doing those tiny little experiments. Even sometimes like when we do one of those, it's going to be hard to say like, okay, is this 100% a learner versus a winner? Like, should we expand on that? Just honestly, the constant decision making. And because it's just the two of us sometimes, it can feel a little decision fatigue of just like, oh my God, are we doing the right thing?
Yeah, it's definitely like, do we have the right portfolio of bets? Like, are we doing enough things that we're like iterating on experiments? Like Natalie was saying, like, do we have enough long-term bets? Like, do we have enough like innovative bets? But are we also doing like smaller optimizations at like important parts of the funnel? I think like figuring out what that portfolio looks like is definitely the hardest part.
How do you approach that? I don't want to ask how do you figure that out because I don't think anybody has it figured out, but how do the two of you approach that? Because that resonates with me, right? You have a million things you want to do. You're not sure if they're the right things to do. You want to balance some of the small things with some of the big things. You're doing some, I would call it trailblazing, where you're planning for the future as well as executing for today. How do y'all approach that?
In theory, it's like leaning on data to do that. In practice, I think it's a blend of our data and like what are high leverage points in our funnel. One of the things that I really admire about our founders and Natalie is that they have like a lot of empathy for customers. And I think that also drives a lot of how we're deploying bets and like what we're focusing on. I think that leaning into like understanding, keeping our ear to the market and also just our data and blending that together is like how we really figure out, okay, this is like a key thing. This is what we're hearing a lot from customers. This is what our CS team and our sales team are talking about, and letting that set what our priorities are.
Could we talk about a recent challenge that y'all have faced and maybe use that kind of as a model to explore together?
Yeah, I'm going to touch a little bit on what I talked about before, that problem of customers finding it maybe like a little difficult to buy right now, not having as much power as they used to. And I think to kind of give a real example to what Raman was just talking about with the data and the qualitative, a lot of it's just when you're getting so many of the same signals from multiple different places over and over. So for example, I'd have people message me on LinkedIn and say like, hey, I really want to try out Navattic, or like be super fans of our brand, but be like, oh, but I can't do it right now. I have no budget. Or the sales team was constantly having deals. I'd make it to the 1-yard line and then the CEO would be like, why don't you just try it with a video first? And they all know it's worse, but they still need to do the free solution. The CS team was maybe hearing that from customers. There was concerns around like, why are we paying right now? Or we're chopping budgets. And then you're seeing in the data, right? Like we're seeing the MQL numbers were a little down. So there's just multiple different data points. And at some point you just have to say, this is my hypothesis from all of it. And we're just going to double down on it. And based off of, I think that's when the data can help you stay focused on like, what's the challenge I really need to solve? But the qualitative helps with the solution. Right? Like I'm hearing a lot of times people saying, I need my CEO's approval. I need my CFO's approval. So then you kind of think, okay, how can we get around that? We're not suggesting like our customers go out and, try to sneak around their CEOs, but like, oh, what's a way that I think even for myself, how do I get around that? Oh, when I put things on a card, I don't need to get that approved. So really just trying to dig in, and that's really how we blend the two together and figure out what to focus on.
Yeah. And so what do you do with all that? Right? So you're saying, hey, I'm learning about these challenges through the qualitative. Now I have more insight into those. Now what? Because now you have all these challenges that are coming at you. Now you've got a long list of challenges. How do you figure out what to do with those?
I think one thing I really love about our company, I try to do a lot, is like we're all really into sharing learnings. So I'll just share those learnings with a few other people at the company. Maybe I'll talk to my CEO being like, are you feeling this? I'll talk to my head of sales, be like, are you feeling this? And then if enough of us are feeling it, and I'm just getting kind of that like, okay, then maybe I might casually pitch, kind of like see a solution to it. And I like to try to maybe think of a few different solutions and pitch them to a few different people and see what their gut check is. So I can give a previous example. In the past, I was getting gut checked that a lot of people were getting really frustrated we didn't have public facing pricing. And again, people messaging me on LinkedIn, deals would talk about like as every stage of the funnel, we saw this frustration. And when I first brought this up, I brought this up since I joined Navattic, I'd gut check it with other leaders and it was a clear like, no, we're not doing that. We got to experiment with pricing. And so I was like, okay.
Or at least a not right now, right? So you saw something early, because this I think will resonate with a lot of folks. You saw something that you thought should be done differently based on your experience and your intuition. You floated it. You got some signals that it was not either the right time or the right project, kept it on the back burner, and then it sounds like it resurfaced with customer data.
Exactly. I love the idea of like, no, it's never a no, it's not right now.
Yeah.
Then that was when we actually pulled in a little more quantitative data to help us. We found like how many people in the book a demo form just asked about pricing. And then it ramped up with like sales was hearing it more and more. And then there was a deal we won where we told them pricing early and that it was faster. And so it was kind of like that magic storm of everyone's getting some positive signals. Like I think I was getting the problem signals for a while, but we weren't getting the positive signals of the opposite. And we finally were. And that's when I repitched it. And that makes it a lot easier. So I kind of think like, this is not the most scientific method, but constantly looking for those problem signals, try and then constantly pitching your team on different ways to solve it and seeing one, do they like it in general, and it's now the right time. Because they might like it, but maybe now's the right time. And when those two things like magically align, then it's like, we've agreed the problem's a real problem, we've agreed on the solution, now let's go and think about really tactical ways we could solve it.
And I've heard the two of you talk about the different data sources that are important to you, the qualitative and the quantitative. For a problem like this, so pricing, we'll use this as an example. If you were to go back in time and estimate, what amount of discovery did you think you spent on the qualitative signals versus the quantitative for a challenge like that?
Honestly, probably like 70% qualitative, and then using the quantitative to almost like be the hammer that knocks it in.
Yeah. The check.
Yeah.
Did it work?
And kind of convince everyone else. Like, I think sometimes I go a little more on my gut and qualitative, and I think Raman's really, really good about maybe bringing in a little more data and checking my qualitative side.
Yeah.
But I do think that's often the thing that like really can get leadership and everyone else on board when you point out some of those quantitative, but it's not always the starter.
And even with the quantitative, I think like highlighting the things that each team cares about. We were just talking about this yesterday, like when going to sales, talking about it more from the lens of like, this is why this is going to make the sales process more efficient or like drive more revenue. And then when you're talking to CS, talking about different parts of that data, I think can be really helpful in like selling it across the organization. So showcasing different parts of the data can be super valuable.
Yeah, it's an important currency. It's an influence currency. And so finding ways to leverage that in different methods and delivery mechanisms makes a ton of sense. So I want to learn a little bit more about pressure, because last week in March, it's the end of Q1. And I think that there's a lot of folks out there that are feeling pressure to produce, to perform, to get their numbers. Maybe they're behind in Q1. Maybe they're ahead in Q1 and they want to just get off to a hot start in Q2. Do you feel any pressure right now?
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of marketers and growth people I've talked to at least have said, 2023 was a tough market and there's a lot of hope for 2024. And I think that hope was a little bit based off vibes, a little bit based on positivity. And it was definitely a little bit of a slower quarter. And also obviously bring on Raman has been so helpful. And now we have a growth team. But when you're bringing on a new hire, you're kind of pitching like, now we have all these extra resources, do all these extra things. It's going to be so great. And there's a certain level which you can't fully control it and someone needs to ramp up. But
of course, right.
It does add a little bit of that extra pressure of like, okay, now that we have a system, I pitched this whole idea. How is it actually going to work out in theory? But I think one thing that's always really interesting about working in SaaS, especially at a startup, like you have this perfect idea of how things should go. But again, if the market's changing and shifting, like we could run a million experiments. But to my point of if people don't have the money right now or need to buy in a different way, it might not really matter. So I feel like there was this pressure, but in another way, I think sometimes using that pressure and taking a step back and being like, is this me? Is this us? Or is there other things going on? And that's when you can get really fun and dive into like, okay, is there a go-to-market shift that's needed? Do I need to think of strategy different? Like when things aren't going well, it's kind of when you get to take that step back and reevaluate your whole I guess, go to market.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because you could do amazing work and not hit your goals because of things that are outside of your control. And in a great market, you can do shitty work and still hit your goals because the market is great. And so that's what makes some of this hard. I wanted to ask you also about pressure, Raman. So you're a few months in, 4 months in?
Yep, 4 months in.
So 4 months in, did you feel pressure to get off to a hot start and to try to have some wins and to try to get a couple up and to the rights on the board?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's like always pressure to get some early wins. I think though, like one of the most valuable things we did was like setting up that framework and that experimentation structure. And I think having that process, everyone sort of recognized the value of that. So I think just getting that check was really valuable, but there's definitely pressure to be like, hey, is there like some quick wins that, you know, we can knock out? And we talked about this too. And I like in my first month, like, hey, what are like parts of the funnel that I can like really get a quick win under my belt? Because I think that's really valuable just to get confidence in the process and get confidence in me and like build credibility across the organization. So I think initially I like wanted to make sure I was working on high leverage parts of the funnel. But the nice thing too about our framework is like just the fact that we're testing things and experimenting, and there's a channel for people to put all their like growth ideas in. That sort of naturally happens where people feel like, hey, like things are working, the team is working, like we're learning things and we're sharing them publicly. Maybe like a little bit less pressure than if I was trying to hit a quota. I think about it more of like, okay, am I able to provide some like tangible learnings, and have I built a system where people can put their ideas into and feel like it's being actioned.
And what I heard you say was that one of the wins actually was creating the system itself.
Yeah.
And that in itself is a huge win. It's a qualitative win. It's not a numbers win. It's not a number moving up and to the right or moving up or down, but that's a huge win in itself. And I think a lot of folks look past that and they just think, well, I've done a bunch of work. It's foundational stuff. I've set up a new reporting infrastructure. I onboarded this new tool. I created a new system. I onboarded a new employee, but I haven't gotten anything yet. And I think they look past that, and that is too bad.
I think one thing I'd add to that really helped, because obviously, you know, like I said, I was expanding the team. I had to make a case for that. And early on, I talked with my CEO and we're basically like 30, 60, 90. This is what we want the new hire, what's what we want Raman to achieve. And so when we just recently had our 90-day review, the question of like, have we been successful? Yes, no. It's really easy to go back to those things and say like, you learned Navattic really well. Oh yeah. And then you set up that framework. And we started some experiments and it became so much less just like, did they bring in 100 more MQLs or did the conversion rate go up by this much? To say from the beginning and show my CEO from the beginning, this is the 30, 60, 90, this is what we want Raman to achieve. And also it was just really fun to go back and be like, oh my God, like we've done a lot in 90 days together. Like this is pretty cool. And I think if we didn't have that, it would have just been like, oh, but our MQLs were down this quarter. That was nothing to do with the structure we put in place or you joining. Like at least my hypothesis is that's different. That's the market.
Yeah. It's about the inputs. Sometimes you have to track the inputs. They can be qualitative inputs and the outputs are obviously the numbers. So I want to get into the outputs. Let's do that in the next episode. Hey, thanks so much for listening. That's going to be it for this mini episode. As a reminder, you are in the middle of listening to a 7-part mini-series going behind the scenes with the Navattic growth team. And I would love your feedback. I'd love to hear what you think so far. If the content is interesting, if you're learning, if it's resonating, let me know. You can either tag me on LinkedIn at Andrew Kaplan, or you can tag the show at Delivering Value Podcast, or leave me a comment. The two best places would be one, either on my Substack, which is at media.deliveringvalue.co, where all of the episodes will be published, or on any of the individual episode pages on YouTube. And if you are enjoying the show, the best thank you would be a review. You know the game. Those reviews help the algorithm surface my show to other folks just like you. Thank you again for listening. On to the next episode.